Welcome, everybody. We're really excited to have you here today. My name is Rachel Owen. I'm the director of MOST Policy Initiative and the coordinator of our fellowship program. And I'm also one of the co-founders of MOST. So I'm really excited. This is the first informational webinar we've ever had for the fellows program. And so hopefully this is informative and you'll be able to ask some questions along the way to learn more about the program. A couple of housekeeping details. Please feel free in the chat to ask questions anytime. Either I will try to answer them as I'm talking, or we also have our current class of fellows on the call, so they can also answer questions in the chat if they are able to. And then there will be some set times where we'll take breaks for question and answer. So hopefully you have some questions ready or the presentation will prompt them. And we'd love to have this as really more of an informal Q&A, not necessarily something that's super formal. Let me see here. Let's get my slides going. Okay, to begin with, I wanted to give just a brief background about Missouri's government. So our program is a legislative fellows program. We place postdoctoral fellows with the Missouri General Assembly. Our General Assembly, we have 197 members total in the capital city of Jefferson City in Missouri. We're located right here along the Missouri River, right in the middle of Missouri. We're about 30 minutes south of Columbia, Missouri, which is where the University of Missouri is located. And it's about halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City, if you're familiar with those regions. But as I mentioned, we have 197 members of our General Assembly. It is a supermajority Republican assembly. I think these numbers are from last year, but they haven't changed a whole lot. And so Republicans have veto power in our legislature. Our governor's office is also held by a Republican. And while it seems like everybody would be in agreement all the time with those numbers, what it really means is that we have a lot of different opinions within the parties and between the parties. And so a lot of complex dynamics to work with, even though it is a supermajority Republican state. When I first moved to Missouri or started working with the General Assembly, I was told that Missouri had an ambitious legislature. So our General Assembly meets from January to May each spring. And within that period of time, they introduce hundreds of bills and hear also quite a lot of those bills in committee. Overall, they usually pass somewhere between 50 and 80 bills every year. Last year was, of course, a little different since the virus ended up pushing the legislature out early. But they're talking about a lot of different topics and they're doing a lot of work in a short period of time in Jefferson City. So it's really important that they have proper resources to be able to incorporate science into the decision-making process. And to compound that, we also have limited staff at the Capitol. So there are partisan staff. Each member of the House typically has either a half a person or one legislative assistant who they work with, who mostly deals with constituent issues. In the Senate, they might have a few more people and one in particular who works on policy issues, but they're pretty short-staffed. So they don't necessarily have time to do in-depth research on topics that come up with legislation. In addition, there is a nonpartisan research office at the Capitol, but they are also pretty small staffed and they mostly serve as a group that drafts bills for policymakers at the Capitol. So for our fellowship program, we worked to develop a program that would both serve as a training experience for scientists, but also fill some of the critical needs at our state capitol. We're a unique program in that we don't place fellows as staff in member offices or on committees. So our fellows work as independent agents at the Capitol. We are a nonprofit organization, so we're not a lobbying group. And because we're not lobbyists, we have to follow some guidelines. So everything that we provide to policymakers, we provide on their request. So we only will answer a question or give them information if they've asked for that information. When we testify, we only testify for informational purposes. We don't take a stance on pending legislation, regardless of if science may support one side or the other. We're there from a neutral perspective, bringing that information. And then giving it to a lawmaker so that they can consider it when they're making their decision. And then finally, everything that we do is made publicly available. So if it's information that we send to a lawmaker, it goes on our website and is open for anybody to be able to see. Missouri is a really diverse state, and so we get to work with a really diverse set of issues, a diverse set of people. We, have everything from people in who are coming from rural places in southern Missouri to people who are coming to Jefferson City from urban centers in Kansas City and St. Louis and everything in between. So we work with a really diverse set of stakeholders to try to identify what the most important topics are going to be. So we can kind of proactively prepare for some of the topics that we're going to get requests on during the legislature, or during the legislative session, sorry. And then as we compile that information, we share the science in a couple different formats. Mostly what we do is share science notes, which are sort of like white papers. They're 2 to 3 page informational briefs that allow a policymaker to see the highlights of that scientific issue, but also some limitations that might be associated with what we know based on scientific literature. In a normal year, we would also be testifying in person at the Capitol quite a bit, but because this year we're mostly working virtually, most of the testimony that we're submitting is written testimony instead of being there testifying during hearings. I mentioned that our fellows are placed as legislative fellows at the Capitol, and in those positions, they cover a suite of topics. So this isn't exactly what the 5 fellows cover right now, but this is an example of the different topics that we cover. So we cover life sciences, agriculture, education and workforce, healthcare, wellness, technology, engineering, energy, environment, public safety, and then economics and some finance. So we cover a really broad range, and we customize the suite of committees that the fellows cover based on their expertise and sort of what makes sense based on the fellowship class. I will say our fellowship is a 2-year fellowship, and so we hired our first cohort last fall. They started. A couple of them are potentially going to leave for other positions, and so we might have up to 2 positions available in this 5-member class for the coming year. But we won't know that for certain for another couple months. We're opening applications because of that, because we want to make sure we have a full class of 5, regardless of what our current class decides they want to do coming up this next year. So I mentioned we have a part-time legislature. So one of the first questions we're always asked is why we start our fellowship program in September. Well, it's really important that our fellows have some sort of knowledge, working knowledge of the landscape of these policy issues in Missouri before they get started with the legislative session. And it's also really important that they're able to build some relationships with the people who are making policies in Jefferson City. So the #1 priority before the legislative session starts is to really build relationships. So we don't have a lot of formal structure to our falls. It's a lot of attending meetings, making phone calls, cold calling policymakers, and trying to get some time on their calendar so that you can introduce yourself and start to build a relationship, learn what's important to them and what's going to be important coming up during the legislative session. Because these are our career development positions, we also have the fellows spend some time in their first few months as a fellow to develop a fellowship plan, really think about what their goals are for the fellowship and what they hope to do with that information after. And then we try to identify fellowship projects. So these are special projects that I'll talk a little bit more in detail about in a moment that the fellows can do on the side to really supplement their experience working with the legislature. From January to May, things get pretty dang busy. So our legislators are moving things through the session pretty quickly. The fellows can tell you a little bit more about what a typical week looks like for us, but they announce committee hearings on Thursdays and Fridays. We scramble to see which bills are being heard in the committee hearings. We reach out to policymakers. We figure out if we've already written a science note on those topics or if they'd like a new science note on those topics. And we're covering, I think, anywhere from 6 to 10 committee hearings a week. with science notes usually written on, about that many bills as well. And so we are pretty busy trying to provide that information and get as much science into the conversation when the policymakers are ready and able to hear that information as possible. And what we found is that's when they're having committee hearings on that issue. And then the hope is that somebody on that committee is then going to hear the scientific information and then they can share it with their colleagues who aren't on that committee, rather than us having to disseminate that information to all 197 members of the legislature. Along the way, during this timeframe too, I think we do get some questions from lawmakers that aren't necessarily related to pending legislation. And so we still do get questions about, something they're hearing from their constituents, or a bill that they might have heard was introduced in Illinois or Iowa, somewhere else around the country, that they're considering introducing in the future. So we do fulfill requests not just on legislation, but also on other topics of interest to policymakers. And then June to August, this is hypothetical, of course, because we haven't had a class go June to August yet. But we have fellowship projects that the fellows were working on. We also hope that they may be able to staff task forces or special committees that meet over the summer if they're looking for expertise within their committees. And then we also hope that the fellows will be able to distribute their knowledge, not of scientific resources or scientific topics per se, but of the whole process of getting science into policy conversations. And so we anticipate we'll have our fellows work on sharing their experience with scientists around the state of Missouri, also potentially doing workshops and presentations with staff who are at the Capitol to help them, find good sources of information if they have to look something up quick for their bosses, and things like that to help build up the science policy capacity in the state. The fellowship projects I'll mention really briefly. This is a concept that is also kind of in flux because we're in our first cohort right now. But the goal of the fellowship projects is to provide the fellows with a supplemental policy experience so that they can better understand how state government entities work. So for example, one of our fellows this year, all of our fellows this year are working with state agencies for these projects. So they serve the legislative branch, but they're working with the executive branch agencies for these fellowship projects. And the outputs of their fellowship project can be anything from program evaluation, policy analysis, a white paper on something that that agency is trying to develop. And it also might entail something like a presentation to people around the state who are working with that agency to collect feedback and to share information about a new initiative that that agency is looking into. So I'll go ahead and let the fellows share in a little bit some of their experiences with the fellowship project so far. I think a lot of the work will come next summer on these projects, and so we're still kind of waiting to see how exactly they will go. Finally, before we break for questions, I do want to talk about the application and how we select our fellows. So first of all, anybody who holds a terminal degree in a STEM field is eligible for the fellowship, or is eligible to be considered for the fellowship. And I do want to stress here that when we talk about science, we really mean that in a broad sense. And so we definitely encourage social behavioral scientists to apply. As I mentioned earlier, we have an education fellow. We bring in a lot of data to conversations in Jefferson City on educational topics. And so we really encourage social scientists to apply for these positions. It's not just if you have your PhD, in a hard science field. We also would really encourage, if you have a background in engineering, math, medicine, to apply. We don't get a lot of applicants in those topic areas. We also consider candidates on a case-by-case basis if they don't have a terminal degree. For instance, that might be if it's not common to get a PhD in their discipline, or if they have a really strong research background from their master's degree. Really, the point of having this as a terminal degree program is that our fellows are oftentimes translating why what the limitations of research might be. And so it's really important that the fellows have a strong understanding of the scientific process and the implications of different types of studies. Something that makes our program a little bit unique compared to some others is that we don't require that you have your terminal degree when you apply for the fellowship program. So you don't have to defend before you apply, but we do require that the fellows have their PhD or terminal degree conferred by September 1st when the fellowship program starts. Our application materials are on our website. It's kind of a clunky, fillable PDF. I apologize. I'm still working on the formatting of the applications. But we ask for some general information, such as contact information. We ask that you submit an abstract related to your dissertation or another significant research project that you've been part of. I will say, remind you that our selection committee is not people in your scientific discipline. And so though this is okay for the abstract to be technical, it also has to be understandable by a broad scientific audience, which is something that we noticed last year in the applications that not everybody conveyed. We asked for 2 letters of recommendation. And in particular, we hope that those letters of recommendation talk about your ability to do science outreach, more or less. So communicate about science to people outside of the scientific enterprise. We ask for a cover letter, a CV, and then we also ask for short answer prompts. And the short answer prompts are really a place where we can see your attitudes towards science policy, sort of what you know already about this discipline, and really just gauge your interest in this intersection between science and research and the policymaking process. And then our advisory board is the selection committee for our fellows program, and they're listed here. There are some changes. We've added a couple members. We have this group of people represents academic researchers who you'll talk to today. We also have policymakers on this list and representatives from different NGOs across the state. And then I'll briefly read through these selection criteria, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Prasasic and Dr. Hendricks to talk about their experience as an advisory board member. But when we're evaluating applications, you're ranked on, all the fellows are ranked on these 5 criteria. So the first is that we would like to see a demonstrated interest in policy practices and procedures at the state level, and in particular in Missouri. So we'd like to see that you've put some research into understanding the state of Missouri and what policy topics are important here. A really important thing that we look for is the capacity to provide nonpartisan, objective information to lawmakers withholding personal biases. So these are not advocacy roles. Advocacy has a very important role in the policymaking process, but our fellows, we really want to be nonpartisan, honest brokers of scientific information. And so we want to be able to see that in your application. And this one really, it's not necessarily easy to demonstrate nonpartisanship, but it is really obvious if you are not demonstrating nonpartisanship. And so if you're advocating for a particular issue in the application, that comes across. And so be a little careful about, it's okay to be passionate about an issue, but being passionate about a policy stance is something that would be a little bit of a red flag. We look for professionalism and maturity. We also look for initiative and the ability to work independently on a variety of tasks. And then the last thing that we look for, which again comes across quite a bit in the applications and in the interviews, is an excellence in written and oral communication, particularly in breaking down complex technical information for a general audience. And again, I'll just bring this up quickly because I reviewed all the applications last year, and I have a PhD. I'm a scientist, but if there were certainly applications where I could not understand the research that the candidate was describing. And so even though you're communicating with a technical audience in some of these questions, it's really important to be able to communicate in a clear way because it's not likely that in this position you're going to be communicating with somebody who has your exact subject matter expertise. And even further, you're probably not going to work very often in your exact subject matter expertise. I don't know if any of the fellows have been able to write a science note on something directly related to their dissertations. So it's often going to be a little bit outside of your field. So this ability to provide excellent communication is really important. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this slide up, but allow Dr. Beth Prasasic, who is on our advisory board and is a researcher at Washington University in St. Louis, and Dr. Mike Hendricks, who is one of the co-founders of MOST. He did his PhD in political science at the University of Missouri and is now a faculty member at Illinois State University. I'd like to allow both of you a chance to give some advice on the selection process, application process.
Thanks, Rachel. And I will let Mike go first since he is a co-founder and has institutional knowledge that I don't have.
Okay, I was going to let you go first since I know you have to go, but
well, yeah. If it runs up too late, then don't forget about me because I do have to leave at 12 for all the folks on the call, but I'll pop my email into the chat. If folks have questions after I have to hop off, feel free to email me.
Okay, so yes, Dr. Mike Hendricks. I'm in the Department of Politics and Government at Illinois State University. I co-founded and co-directed MOST with Rachel from 2016 to 2019. And I am on the advisory board for the fellows and also the vice president of MOST Initiative, MOST Policy Initiative, the nonprofit that oversees the fellowship. So I was part of the fellowship applicant review process last spring, and it's a twofold step. First, the advisory board goes through what was on slide 14, and we filter out applicants that we think deserve to get an in-person interview based on the material you provide us and our thinking of your ability to actually succeed as a fellow, providing that nonpartisan scientific information and advice to policymakers when they seek it. And then if you make it through that process, you then get invited to an interview, and the interview takes place, it's usually around an hour and a half long, I believe, Rachel, to 2 hours maybe. And it's usually, Rachel is on all of them. And then there's usually 2 to 3 advisory board members on the interviews as well. And we asked direct questions related to these 5 topics that are on the screen. And we try to judge you based on these 5 topics and basically try to understand if you would succeed as a fellow in providing that nonpartisan scientific advice to fellows. And some of the things I really looked for was that nonpartisan objective, because we do have a supermajority of one party in the legislative body that is, for some reason, still hesitant towards science. So we need to establish those strong relationships by saying, hey, we're here to provide just objective scientific advice when you ask for it. We're not providing you with any lobbying type perspective. This is what the science says. This is what the science doesn't say. Take it as you will, use it as you will, but this is what we're giving you. Another important aspect that I looked for, I think it was on the previous slide though, was to break down scientific information outside your expertise, because like Rachel said, you are likely not going to be researching science for policymakers that are directly related to your expertise. So we asked specific questions about how you would go about this in the actual interview process, and give you perhaps a scenario of explaining how you would actually go about researching a topic that's outside your expertise. And we judge you based on your response to that question. So I would contact experts in the field to try to get their scientific information or their background and provide me with guidance on where I should look for literature reviews or papers that have studied it recently, things of these nature. So we want to see your adaptability as well. I can continue, but I'll let Beth go just so she can get in.
Yeah, hey everyone. I totally agree with everything Rachel talked about in the earlier slides and everything Mike just said. I think for most of us on the advisory board who are looking through applications and interviewing folks, it was really important to all of us that they demonstrate an ability to be neutral, nonpartisan. And Rachel said something that was really important. You know, it's okay to be passionate about a topic, but you can't be in the role as a fellow lobbying or sort of advocating for that particular position. So I have a background in journalism, and I was always taught, you know, it's impossible to not have positions and bias, but you have to be able to put them aside and to know when they're creeping in and be able to be neutral. And as scientists, we're not trained in that usually. We're not trained in a lot of these things. And so I think it's okay if you don't have the experience to be able to write about, you know, a time where you talked to a policymaker and remain neutral, because we don't get trained in that. We don't often do that. But just being able to convey in the way that you're writing and the way that you're discussing topics that you're passionate about, that's going to come through whether or not you're able to put aside your personal positions and be neutral and be that nonpartisan source of science. I think the other thing that's important in these roles, and I was a fellow in the U.S. Senate, and so this is where I learned this, is having a sense of humility. You know, everybody does have to have a terminal degree, so we're all pretty smart. We're probably really type A people who go into these sorts of positions, but it's important to remember that you are not you know, the smartest person in the room, and to be able to deliver information in a way, to Rachel's earlier point, building relationships in a way that doesn't come across as the know-it-all scientist, and to what Mike was saying, sort of delivering the information to the policymaker as a resource, not as a here's the what the science says you should do, but being able to say, here's the expertise I can bring to you to complement your existing expertise, and really making sure that you don't come across as sort of the know-it-all, I think is really, really important. And not just kind of telling yourself you're not the know-it-all, because you're not. These are really smart policymakers who know things about the policymaking process that many of us don't. So I think it is just, I look in the application for a sense of humility and wanting to learn and recognizing where you have gaps in your knowledge. I think it's far better to raise your hand and say, hey, I have a gap in this knowledge, or hey, I'm not the expert here, than it is to sort of try and become the expert on paper when you don't have the experience to back it up. So I look for humility, and then as a demonstration through your writing that you can talk in a nonpartisan way, in a clear, concise way that everybody will be able to understand. Even if you don't have the experience, even if you don't have that line on your CV that says I've done science communication training or I've done policy experience, that's okay, at least for me. But being able to show that you know how that's going to look, and that you have the ability to do that in a nonpartisan, clear way is to me just as good as sort of having that formal training. Because we had people certainly who had formal training, and to Rachel's point, you wouldn't know that by reading what they wrote. So to me, it's a balance of being able to demonstrate those skills, even if you don't have them on your CV.
Thanks, Beth. I think you have to run probably, but thank you.
You have to run. I'm so sorry. I have another meeting that I can't miss because my mentor is presenting. So I put my email in the chat. If anybody has questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to discuss the process more. It's a really, really great opportunity for anybody who's interested in science and policy making. I had learned a tremendous amount when I did a policy fellowship, and it's still paying dividends years later. So highly recommend, if anybody's interested, at least apply and see where it goes. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye, Rachel. Bye, Mike. Bye, everybody.
I would also add to, within both the written application and then if you make it to the interview portion of the application process, or show your interest in Missouri, show you understand the state politics of Missouri, and also some important policy initiatives that are on the ballot or in basically in the legislative process, and try to relate how you as a scientist could contribute to some of these policy issues that are coming up or that have been talked about within the state. So even if you're not from Missouri, and even if you are from Missouri, hopefully you know some of these policy issues that are occurring. But if you're not from the state, make sure you do your research, show how you can contribute to the state of Missouri and its constituents by providing science and science-based evidence to the policymakers.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we don't require that you have any connection at all to Missouri to apply for the program, but we do want to know that you are actually excited and interested to learn about Missouri and work in this state. And that's one, because you get to be here for 2 years, and we hope that you'll stay for 2 years and enjoy your time in the state, but also because policymakers can tell if you're not really vested in the state. And we want these fellows to not just be here as a training experience, but also I really think that they're adding a very valuable resource to the policymaking process in Missouri. And so we hope that that you're interested and excited about really contributing science into policy conversations and helping policymakers make the best decisions possible for their constituents. And then one other thing I'd like to add related to the selection process, and I do see that there's a question in the chat. If you have a question specifically about the selection process for Mike, you can ask it now. One other thing I'll add. So in the interview process, so if you're selected for an interview, we ask that all of our candidates submit a science note in advance, and usually we'll send you the prompt about 1 week prior to the interview, kind of trying to simulate the time frame that you would have as a fellow to respond to requests at certain times. And then in the interview, we ask you to testify on that science note topic. And that's really also where we can see if you are bringing nonpartisan information forward, if you understand that topic in Missouri. And it's also a really good time to showcase that you can have humility, because we're going to try to throw questions at you that might be partisan or might be things that you don't know. And we want to be able to hear you say, I don't know. I can get you that information, but I didn't do research into that. And be able to kind of steer the conversation back to the scientific information and not get engaged with some of the partisan politics. Okay, I think that the two questions that we have in the chat right now, I'm going to cover here soon. And so I will answer those here in the next couple slides. Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on, and then please feel free to keep popping questions into the chat, and I'll answer them as we go here. Okay, so the question, is the fellowship a 2-year commitment? So what we say is that we offer a 1-year fellowship with the option to continue that fellowship into a 2nd year. It's really nice to have that 2 years. I think our fellows could probably tell you that this legislative session has been a whirlwind, and next year they're going to be a lot more prepared for when legislative session starts. You also have those 2 years to develop relationships with policymakers, which positions you as a trusted messenger of information. So there's a lot of benefits, I think, to having this as a 2-year program, which is why we provide the option to have it as a 2-year program. But we ask for a 1-year commitment to start out with. The fellows are compensated as postdocs, and so we provide a $50,000 a year stipend with benefit options provided through the University of Missouri. We offer professional development funding for you to attend conferences, get training, go to events, and then we also allow moving expenses, can cover relocation expenses if you're moving from out of state. We do ask that you reside in Missouri, and preferably in central Missouri during the time of your fellowship. This year is a little bit different. Everybody is based in Missouri, but it's a little bit easier to do your job from a different place this year because almost everything that we're doing is remote. We hope that by September, at least by next January, we'll be doing a lot in person. And so we think it's valuable for fellows to be based in central Missouri. And then, okay, so now I'll get to the visa question here. So fellows are employed as postdoctoral fellows at the University of Missouri. What that means fellows are not is they are not contract workers. So you're on a permanent employee status as staff at the university, and the fellows are not employees of the state. So they may be working with the state legislature, but they are not state of Missouri employees. They're University of Missouri employees. With that, postdoctoral fellows are offered full benefits and different options at the university. And so the fellows have those options. And then we also are able to sponsor visas because we're based at the University of Missouri. Our legislative fellows, we don't require that you be a US citizen, you aren't handling any sensitive data. We do have an executive branch fellow, and for that position, we require that you be a US citizen or a permanent resident. But for the legislative fellow positions, we can sponsor visas. And it's just something that we would consider on a case-by-case basis. And so if you have further questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. We didn't sponsor any this last year, and so we don't have experience in that, but we know we can do it through the University of Missouri. And it'd just be a new skill that I get to learn as the director of this program, so that'd be great. And then another perk of being part of the University of Missouri is that our fellows have access to a lot of postdoctoral resources across the university. So they can be engaged in the postdoc association. They might have access to some different national memberships. I think we have individual membership through the National Postdoc Association that you can be part of. And then you get access to university libraries, university professional development events, and all those types of things as well. Mike sent me a question here or something that I should mention. So let me go back. So I guess one thing to mention on the compensation. So we chose $50,000 for a couple of different reasons. So that may sound really low compared to the AAAS fellowship compensation, but it is comparable in a cost of living comparison, working and living in central Missouri compared to Washington, D.C. And so hopefully it's adequate, more than adequate compensation for living here in central Missouri. It also is very comparable with what other postdoctoral fellows make at the University of Missouri. I think that the minimum for a postdoc is in the upper 40s. And so we priced it or just set that stipend compared to that as well. Unfortunately, right now, we do not have any flexibility. So if you are a mid-career researcher and that would be, like a real big pay cut for you, we don't have a lot of flexibility in changing that stipend up. But in the future, we would consider that. And so if you do have questions, please just feel free to reach out to me individually. Okay, so now I'd like to turn it over to our inaugural cohort of fellows. So I'm going to introduce them all real fast. I think they're all on the call, and they don't necessarily have remarks planned, but this is a time for you to be able to ask them questions. We have 3 fellows who moved here from out of state and 2 that graduated from Missouri institutions, so they can share that experience. And then I'll also mention the topic areas that they cover. So Dr. Jill Barnes is our fellow covering children, families, and seniors policies. She has her PhD in exercise science, exercise physiology from the University of Missouri. I never remember what it is. We have Dr. Jenny Bratbird. Jenny joined us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she got her PhD in molecular biology. You guys can correct me if I am wrong on any of these things. And she covers transportation, public safety, energy, and environment policy. Dr. Eleni Bickel covers agriculture, natural resources, and economic development policy, and her PhD is in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri. Dr. Josh Mueller covers health and mental health policy, and he has his PhD in dynamical neuroscience from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And then Dr. Brittany Whitley is our fellow covering education and workforce. And she joined us from Seattle, Washington. She did her PhD there at the University of Washington in cellular and molecular biology, I believe. And so they're here, happy to answer questions for you. So if you have any, feel free to type them in the chat, or also feel free to ask them out loud. Do any of you, maybe I might ask for you out-of-staters, the 3 out-of-staters, why you were interested in coming to Missouri and how you think you demonstrated that in your applications and interviews, your interest in Missouri.
Yeah, I can make a quick why Missouri pitch. I guess it was somewhat of not a totally unnatural transition for me. I grew up in Ohio in Midwest, and my family's still there. So I feel like culturally, there's a lot of similarities. Demographically, the way the state is organized, politically, a lot of similarities. So that I think was comfortable for me. But thinking in terms of like aside from the sort of lifestyle, maybe sort of things, thinking more professionally here, I think Missouri is a state that really has a lot of potential for impact from programs like this. Rachel talked about a little bit the structure of the legislature here. The fact that it's a part-time legislature, I think really is appealing, is a way for groups like ours to make sure that sort of when the action is happening, that that there are resources in the conversation being applied. Whereas I think if you think at the federal level, it's kind of like, although there are recesses and things like that, it's sort of like an endless slow grind. Whereas right now what we're seeing at the beginning of session is that things are kind of flying off the presses. It's really, really, really active. And so it feels like it's the sort of environment where if you're sort of enterprising, you can get in and actually make a difference. So I think the political structure there makes it interesting. And then I'll also point out that because Missouri has term limits, I think this is something that we've heard over and over and over from people in government, outside of government, all over the place, that having a sort of knowledge base that lives outside of the legislature is a really effective thing, because, you know, one thing that we're looking at right now is how to build relationships with freshman lawmakers who maybe are coming to policy totally new from something totally different, and are looking for resources that aren't necessarily lobbyists or coming from a particular perspective. So I think on those 2 fronts, like structurally, it was really exciting. I think it was a really good opportunity for us to actually feel like we're making a contribution and not just being swamped in sort of like endless wave of policy making that never ends.
I completely agree with everything that Josh just said. And the one thing I want to add on for me that was really exciting about coming here was the regional diversity of Missouri. And so Missouri is a really cool state. So I've lived mostly on coasts my entire life. I was born in Florida, and then I did my PhD in Seattle. I lived in California for most of my life. And Missouri is a really interesting place because of all the reasons Josh listed, and also because of this diversity that I mentioned, where there's you have these really big rural areas, and rural Missouri in and of itself is not kind of this one thing. There's different types of rural Missouri, and Missouri also has these 2 large, I mean, arguably 3 urban cores, at least 2, Kansas City and St. Louis. And so I think that we see a lot of kind of the outcomes of that play out in the General Assembly. And I think it's really exciting to be working in this space. And education, thinking about how an education policy is going to impact rural Missouri compared to St. Louis County, compared to St. Louis City, is I think a really, really good opportunity to think about the way that policy impacts everybody, and some often in different ways. And so that for me was another real perk of coming to Missouri.
Eleni or Jill, could you maybe talk about some of the feedback that you've received from policymakers lately since legislative session started? I know you both, Eleni had a science note and testimony that got picked up by a reporter recently on one of the bills that she was covering. And Jill, I know you've gotten a lot of really positive comments back from some of the staff. Can you talk about kind of those experiences and the role that you feel that you're playing in the policymaking process in Jefferson City?
You can go first, Jill, if you want.
Okay. Yeah, so I haven't had a moment to testify yet like Eleni has, but in regards to some comments that I've gotten back from staff members, it's just been that our science notes have been really great and informative and that they're very concise and that they truly are making a difference and an impact by providing a lot of information that, you know, they're not getting access to. So just knowing that even with just a simple thing like writing a science note, you're still having a large impact and you're really helping out some of our most vulnerable Missourians, I think is really great.
I agree. Before I had the chance to testify, I think all of the fellows noticed very early on that legislators and their staff and all the people who work at the agencies here really appreciate the work that we're doing at most. But one of the most impactful things that I think so far I've done is testifying in person, because you can have them ask you questions and they kind of reach out to you after that and try to verify some of the things that you say, and they're asking you for more information on things. Today, I testified in the morning on a bill that I was writing a science note over the last week. So the person who asked the science note is the chairman of the committee, and whenever he was introducing the bill, he introduced how amazing our report was and how everybody should read it and how important it was for making his bill a reality. And I do want to mention that all of the fellows are doing a really good job. I think it's a process of a teamwork. So I don't know if maybe Rachel didn't mention it too heavily, but I think a big chunk of what we do is reviewing science notes. So whenever we are out there, either submitting written testimonies or in person or giving it to our journalists, we know we are at least confident enough that we're not missing big things or missing big aspects of the topic. So a lot of the things that we do on a daily basis as fellows is reviewing the science notes and making sure that that peer review process is established.
Yeah, I think that's something that's been pretty fun and exciting about the science notes, is that we do have an internal peer review process, and we also try our best to reach out to experts around the state if we have time. And so we really are trying to make sure that these are good, well-resourced pieces of information, but then we also do checks to make sure that we're not leaving out major topics that some different people around the state are raising as concerns. We try to make sure that we are avoiding any types of terminology that might be seen as partisan, because you never know, those change quite a bit sometimes. So we try to stay on top of that type of editorial component as well with the science notes, so that we can provide good nonpartisan information. And then the last question that I'll ask is, Jenny, if you're there, I would like if you could cover or talk about what it's like to cover a really broad range of topics, especially ones that are all outside of your PhD research.
Sure, yeah. So I think all of us cover topics that are pretty far outside our training and our PhD. And I think it's a really helpful opportunity, because in policy, that's what you're usually going to be doing is not something super specific, but covering more areas. In my role, I have topics related to energy, environment, public safety, and transportation. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to dig into all these different topics and learn. And I think MOST is a great place for that. Rachel has been really helpful in connecting me to other people, and so the other fellows. It's a very collaborative environment. So I think it's a great place to learn these skills for sure.
I'll pause here and try to make sure that we're giving time for you to submit questions or ask questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? So maybe a more general question. Jenny, you commented on this, but well, I'll make a comment and then ask a question to the fellows, but we do try to focus on career development and professional development within the fellows class. And so I try to make sure I'm taking feedback and getting fellows the resources that they need, or bringing in people who can get them the resources that they need for their next career step. And so maybe you could talk about what professional development looks like with our team, and something, I don't know, something in particular you're learning to prepare you for your next job.
I can start off, just because what I really like, one of the things I really like about most is that when Rachel talks about professional development, it's not just like this thing of like, oh yeah, most supports professional development. Like, I think we've been here for 5 months so far, and we've already had several opportunities, which I think really highlights that most and Rachel have a real commitment to giving us these opportunities. For me, my top 2 so far, we were able to go to the National Science Policy Network conference. It was virtual, and the workshops and networking that were a part of that, it was my first NSPN meeting, and I really I was floored. I thought it was so great. Made some great connections there of people I've been talking with and working with moving forward. The other thing is, when we first started off, Rachel signed us up for a policy analysis class. Debbie Stein, some of you might be familiar with her. She runs the Science and Technology Policy Academy, I think. I might have gotten that name wrong. And we took all of the fellows took a policy analysis class. I signed up for an extra class to look at benefit cost analysis, risk management, and cost effectiveness analysis. And so I really feel like I'm becoming a bona fide policy analyst in a lot of ways. And so the opportunities to kind of practice that in real time has been really helpful. And then of course, writing science notes. I think it's hard to beat that experience when you have to turn a science note around in 4 days about something you haven't thought too much about. You're getting some real life skills there.
Do you guys have anything else to add? We do have a question that came in that I can ask. So this is a question for Jenny, Brittany, and Josh. And just how welcoming was Central Missouri for you coming in from out of state? And do you find any challenges in communicating with policymakers? Do they ask about your background? Is being from out of state, has that presented any barriers? And Eleni, you can possibly answer this one too, because you have an accent, so people typically know that you were not born and raised in Missouri, and I know that that's come up in a couple conversations as well. So how welcoming is Jefferson City, and has being from out of state presented any barriers for you?
I can start if. I guess everybody can, like Rachel mentioned, everybody can instantly understand that I didn't grow up in Columbia. And as Rachel mentioned, I do cover the agricultural policy, and a lot of the folks in my committees are very everyday people who do not have necessarily the social skills that you would expect in academia, that you're not supposed to ask these questions, but everybody instantly asks me where I'm from and where's this accent from. So I got really comfortable about answering it, because I think mentioning the fact that I grew up in a rural part of Greece really points to my interest in doing this specific, in covering the specific area, because they care about agriculture, they care about rural Missouri, and I grew up in an agricultural place, and that's what I care about. But also kind of bringing in the things that bond us. Like, I'm married to a Missourian, I have a second generation Missourian raising in my house, and all these things that they also care about kind of makes that connection happen. And then after that, talking about the facts and talking about your research, being honest about the things that you don't know, and recognizing that so many already have mentioned that you're not the expert in the room, that you're probably learning as much as they do from your science notes, is really making it a process of you're not there to teach them anything, even though you're not from their state. You're there to discover ways to help them do their job better. So even though that may be an issue, depending on the area that you're covering, I don't think that's going to be an issue of like difficult issue. It's just going to be something that the way may be bringing up.
When I first started, and was reaching out to General Assembly members, I had a couple people that when they asked where I got my PhD and I said Seattle, they felt the need to remind me. They said, you know, Missouri is not like Seattle, right? And I said, yes, I understand that. And I'm really excited to talk about, you know, whatever thing I was there to talk with them about. Beyond that, I never really got a whole lot of pushback. I think like everyone else is saying, kind of being humble and respectful really goes a long way. And then in terms of the actual physical space, I think all of the fellows are living in Columbia right now. Pandemic makes things a little bit weird in terms of like how much you can actually experience the city around you. But I've really liked it. It was certainly a shift from Seattle, but a welcome one for me, to be sure.
Maybe in our last few minutes, I might just ask Mike and the fellows, if you, what piece of advice would you offer to people interested in applying for the Most Policy Fellowship? I should have prepared you for this. Sorry.
I'll give like very boring dry advice here. I think it's kind of been brought up a few times here that a lot of our work is based around taking some topic that maybe you're like tangentially aware of or just hearing about and then having to do a deep dive on it. So I think being proactive on that front, if you kind of know, you know, I'm interested in environmental issues, just to make that a part of your sort of nights and weekends or whatever it might be, to like familiarize yourself with what sort of issues are actually out there at the state level, you know, either here in Missouri or just at the state level in general, like what sort of portfolios are states handling in that regard, or at the federal level as well, because I think there's gonna be a lot of overlap. But I think just having that sort of like, yeah, searching mindset of trying to branch out and figure out what sort of little puzzle pieces are out there is really helpful, because a lot of times, you know, we're on phone calls or we're going to be meeting with people, and if they tell you about this issue and your eyes go like totally blank because you've never heard of, you know, someone just said science out on anhydrous ammonia, right? And if that's just a totally foreign concept to you, like it might put you on your back foot. So I think having just that sort of shallow awareness of a broad set that will do you a lot of good.
Maybe one more person for the sake of time here. Oh, and I'll switch to my last slide, which has application details.
I would say don't be afraid to reach out and talk, especially if you have specific questions. And a lot of this job is, you know, reaching out to experts, reaching out to legislators, and starting conversations. So that would be my advice. If you want more information, you know, go and get it.
Can I add one thing in really quick, Rachel?
Go for it.
If you haven't already, try to get in the room with like one of your local legislators, whether you're in Missouri or I guess maybe the virtual room, do a phone call, like talk some of these issues out. Your scientific society might have some opportunities. That's what I did. My PhD was in mitochondria, and I went and talked about rare mitochondrial diseases with my local legislators in Seattle. So find something, try to do that, and then you can get a feel for kind of what our day-to-day looks like in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that was the final piece of advice I was going to give, that it's not part of our selection criteria that you have an understanding of the policymaking process, because that's something you can learn on the go. But it is really helpful if you've, you know, thought about what conversations with policymakers look like and the role that scientists play in that process. So any experiences that you can get, even if you don't have any of those experiences right now, anything that you can do in the next month or so to engage a little bit with that process is really helpful to be able to demonstrate in the interviews and applications. So I'm going to go ahead and close it up. If there are any questions at all, please feel free to email me or any of the fellows. Our contact information is all on our website. The applications are open through March 15th at 5 p.m. Central Time, and I have the URL listed here, but I'll also send this in an email. And before we leave, I just want to give a quick shout out to our generous sponsors. We have funding from several different foundations that make this fellowship program possible, including the James McDonald Foundation out of St. Louis, and then the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And we also receive support from the University of Missouri. And so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here, but please feel free to reach out if you have questions. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you guys. Take care.